Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. In the wake of our discussions about the rise of cities in the late 19th century, if you're one of my students, we need to discuss briefly one of the more unsavory aspects of urban life at the end of the 19th century, and that is the rise and influence, both good and bad, of political machines. Many major cities in the United States in the late 19th century had some form of political machine as one of the backbones of its operation. Chicago, Philadelphia, St. Louis, most notably New York, and we'll get into that one in more detail here in a minute. But first, just to go over real quickly what a political machine is. It's an organization that exists in a city. It might be loosely tied to one political party, for instance, where a small group of leaders or one major leader, usually known as a boss, will have supporters, like their campaign workers and stuff like that, who will help them maintain political power. Go get out the vote, encourage people to support the party, the machine, etc. And then when that party is given power through an election, usually, they will dole out rewards, very similar to the spoils system that we talked about when we just studied Andrew Jackson. So it was kind of a quid pro quo. You help us get elected, we'll reward you with some sort of patronage and some kind of job. It didn't necessarily have to be corrupt. There didn't have to be any kind of illegal activity or bribery going on. Giving out jobs in return for political support was not illegal at this time. So that wasn't really corruption in the literal sense, but it certainly was, towing the ethical line a little bit, and in some cases maybe going over it. And we'll look at in one particular case, in the case of Tammany Hall, how they repeatedly stepped over that line. The Democratic Party machine in New York City that dominated politics there for nearly a century, from the 1840s through the Great Depression, was known as Tammany Hall, after a building in New York City that was famous for political meetings. And it was founded in the 1820s, but it had some moderate influence in government. And then in the 1840s and 50s, they really, really started to become powerful because they began cozying up to Irish immigrants who were pouring into the city in droves because of the potato famine of the 1840s. So when immigrants would come into the country, operatives from Tammany Hall would help set them up with jobs, with a place to live, and would sort of speed up the process of them becoming citizens, which is very important to the political machine because if you are a citizen, you can vote. And you're probably going to vote for the organization that helped you get a roof over your head and a job when you first came into the country. So Tammany Hall thrived off this good relationship that it had with the Irish Catholic community in New York City. And of course, this organization also thrived off of kickbacks and bribes that it got from businesses. So, for instance, if you were looking to build some skyscraper in the city, and you needed to get permits and contracts and all that stuff to do that, you could go to someone in the government at Tammany Hall if you knew them, and you could say, I need to get this done, and they could help push it through for you. They could help get you the stuff that you needed to get this project underway. Of course, that usually is going to involve you having to pay a little extra to them. So businessmen actually like political machines because, yeah, maybe they had to pay a little bit extra to get access into the government, but it also cut a lot of the red tape and the bureaucracy and made things really efficient. So graft was one way that machines sort of maintain power and wealth. And graft is when someone uses their political clout for personal reward. Tammany Hall is often synonymous with William Tweed, best known as Boss Tweed, who was the leader of Tammany Hall for 13 years, from 1858 to 1871. And in the years before the Civil War, he was penniless and was worth millions by the time he left as the leader of the machine by 1871. And he mostly got rich through corruption and kickbacks that he got from people. One example of a way that he would profit from his dealings within the machine that I've read about before is he would tell contractors who were doing something for the city to bill the city for 5 times what it was actually going to cost. So if something was going to cost $100,000, he said, bill us for $500,000. And of course, the contract would be approved because the people who were approving those were also Tammany Hall people that Tweed had put into office as part of this system. And so, the person building this thing would get the $500,000, and that means he had $400,000 more than he needed to complete the project. So some of that money goes back to Tweed, and some of it stays with that person as well. So conservative estimates at the time said that Tweed took anywhere from 25 to 45 million dollars out of the New York City bank accounts that he did not have any legitimate right to. Modern historians have looked into his dealings more and say that it actually might have been more like $200 million, and that's $200 million, in money back then, that he took. So pretty ridiculous sums of money. With the rise of more popular journalism in the late 1800s, political machines start to come under more scrutiny from the press, and that begins to erode the support for Tweed and Tammany Hall within New York City, and support for machines all across the country. One of the most notable critics of Boss Tweed in particular was Thomas Nast, who was a very famous political cartoonist at the time for Harper's Weekly magazine. You probably best know Nast. He's the person who popularized the donkey and the elephant as the symbols for the Democratic and Republican Party, respectively. But he was a notable political cartoonist and drew a lot of cartoons that were critical of Tammany Hall and of Tweed in particular. And Tweed finally gets pinched on some corruption charges in the early 1870s. He is found guilty but is sentenced to house arrest. And he ends up skipping his bail, and he flees the country and goes to Spain and ends up working just on a ship as a routine seaman. And he is captured in Spain and returned to prison. And the reason he was captured is somebody on the ship he was on recognized him from a Thomas Nast cartoon and alerted the authorities that this fugitive was in Spain, and he was sent back to prison in New York, and he died in prison penniless again in 1878. There are quite a few of these cartoons out there, but here are a couple more notable Thomas Nast cartoons that were critical of Boss Tweed. The one on the left, in counting there is strength, implying that he controls the voting mechanisms in New York City. The one on the right portraying him as sort of a gluttonous Roman king of sorts. And again, it was these cartoons just in the media over and over and over again through the 1870s that eroded his support, and it made Tweed furious. And he actually said to an aide one time, "You got to get these pictures out of the magazine." I think the exact quote was, "My constituents can't read, but they can recognize these damn pictures of me." So shows maybe he didn't have the most esteem for the people who supported him, but was pretty self-conscious about how he was viewed. Machines eventually lose their clout. Reforms begin to come into play, both at the national and the state and local level. The spoils system was eliminated in the federal government in 1883 by the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, which we'll talk about later if you're one of my students. The progressive era of the early 20th century saw a lot of ethics reforms at the state and local levels as well, which sort of eliminated patronage in the spoils system and all of that. City machines do persist into the 20th century in some form. Nothing like you had with Tammany Hall, with the widespread corruption and pay for play and all that kind of stuff. The picture there is of a guy named Richard Daley, who was the mayor of Chicago for a really long time, and maybe the closest thing in the last 50 or 60 years to a political machine that we've had in the United States is the Cook County or Chicago Democratic Party, which had its tentacles kind of everywhere and had influence all throughout city government. And Chicago politics is often synonymous with corruption, and a lot of that comes from Daley and his influence there. But again, nothing like you had in the late 1800s. That'll do it for now. Feel free to post questions in the comments, or if you're one of my students, you feel free to ask in class. Cheers.